We're talking about physical disabilities, visual disabilities, and cognitive disabilities are really kind of the three key things that I hit on. So before I go into that, just to explain, I'm an occupational therapist. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but basically, I thought Natalie's presentation was so great. And for 10 years of my career, I was doing what you saw in those videos, rehabbing patients with brain injury, stroke, spinal cord injuries, amputations, things like that. So I spent 10 years full-time at the University of Utah Hospital in the inpatient rehab, where patients like that come for months and rehab. And OT, we help people do their daily tasks. I mean, that's really, and we have a physical therapist that's kind of working on walking and legs and rehab, and then a speech therapist that's kind of memory, speech, obviously, understanding. And then I kind of do everything else. So teaching the patient how to get back to taking care of themselves at the most basic level. So, hi.
Cole, did you have a hard time finding this room?
Oh,
Yes.
I probably should stop.
How you know?
New share, I guess. I kind of forgot there's people on Zoom. All right. Hopefully that's all I do. Hopefully the AV guy will come in. So yeah, that was the first 10 years of my career rehabbing patients like Natalie. I was just saying that have suffered those injuries. And then I basically had twins and went part-time, and they said, hey, can you come do our driving program? And I thought, oh, no, thanks. I don't know if you guys fell into driving, but I kind of fell into driving. But actually, I kind of went and shadowed, and I actually really loving it. I think because as an occupational therapist, my job is to help people be independent again. And driving is so important to people. No matter if they're just wanting and starting to drive like you guys see, or if they've driven before and want to do that again. And so that's kind of who I work with, through the spectrum, everywhere from teenagers like you guys see, all the way up until kind of end of life and driving retirement. I have a lot of those conversations as well, that assessing if a patient is still safe and capable of driving as well. So that's kind of as I say, the non-sexy part of my job. And the fun, most interesting part is probably what I'm going to talk to you most about, which is adapting vehicles and things like that. And that's really fun when we can do that. So as an occupational therapist, I'm trained in rehabilitation for physical disabilities, vision, cognition, and which mainly are the components for driving, of course. So at the University of Utah, at our SUGARHOUSE clinic, that's where our driving program operates, and I'm the only person that does driving in that whole system. And so what I mainly do, and what I'm going to talk about mainly to you guys, is driving evaluations, which are it's a 2-hour appointment, and it's typically $200. Now, insurance companies don't pay for this service, so it's not part of anybody's health insurance. So it's a cash pay system for you guys. And if you're referring a client, a student, the state and your school will cover that cost. And so Audra and I have worked together several times with different students, different situations where they cover the cost of the evaluation. So that's nice for the student and the families to know. But they do have to come in person to our clinic, which is hard when you're working, and you live so far away. So I'll talk mainly about driving evaluations. I also do driving training and practice, particularly with adaptive equipment. So things we're going to talk about, like hand controls, things like that. I do driving rehabilitation, those patients like Natalie, who she probably had to learn to drive again. And that's part of my, a lot of our clients that are coming in post-stroke, post-brain injury, are working with our therapist and myself to do clinical return to drive, and then with myself doing on the road. And then we have a wellness driving program as well, where we allow patients to come in and use our driving simulator. So a lot of our students that have never driven before and are now going to drive with maybe hand controls or something, they can come in and practice on the simulator, which is nice, but as you know, on the road kind of tells you a lot. So like I said, driving evaluation, school districts will cover it. the student would need to come in for a 2-hour appointment. And my job really is to assess their skills and abilities related to driving and make sure it's a good fit and that they are fit to drive. And so we're going to talk about how I do that. Basically, I start off with, okay, what the students coming to me, what's the situation? You know, oftentimes, hopefully the family's there, the parents, and they're, you know, where are we at? Do they already have a vehicle? Is it adapted in some way? Does it have a lift, a ramp, any adaptive equipment in it? And then, you know, kind of what is the student's experience as related to driving? So, you know, I think that this is probably the biggest point is hopefully by the time they are working with you guys or you're working with them to get their driving permits. Is that right? So do some of them already have them maybe when they're starting their class or, okay. So that is a helpful time for a student to come and see me because they know and understand a few of the rules of the road. They don't have to. And in our clinic, I see students all the time that have, you know, they're 14, gonna turn 15. Their parents want to start thinking about it. They want to get ahead of the game. Most of the time it's 15, turning 16 or already 16. Some of them have driving permits and some of them don't. But I think if they have a little bit of an understanding of rules of the road, it's really helpful. So for my assessment, basically what I'm looking at is their physical abilities, like I said, their visual abilities, their cognition, and that leads to reaction time. So a lot of parents are coming to me with all sorts of kids, and I'm sure you've seen all sorts of kids with these types of disabilities. I think one of the most common is probably maybe our neurotypical kids, maybe autism or ADHD. And then on, you know, like I said, the physical disabilities are a little bit easier to address and adapt. And then the vision and cognition are usually a little bit more tricky and the timing on when the student's ready to drive. So let's get the physical disabilities maybe out of the way and discuss those. You know, I'm assessing that the student, in this case, their neck range of motion, their upper and lower extremity limb function. So can the student, you know, do what they need to do with their hands or their shoulders? Can they reach the steering wheel? Could they use the turn signal? Can they feel their hands? You know, can they grasp? Things like that. Lower extremity function is, of course, important, right? Do they have the ability to control the standard pedals by themselves, or, you know, push the gas and brake? Do they have one side, maybe their right side that you typically use for driving, is impaired? And so we talk about maybe using their left leg for driving. Lower extremity function, if you think of that, we think of strength and range of motion, right? Does the student, you know, reach the pedals okay? Can they physically move their leg side to side? But also something we don't think about a lot is sensation and something called proprioception. So not only can they feel their limb, but do they know where their limb is in space? Oftentimes that's the problem that nobody's identified yet. Because if you can't feel if your foot is flexed or extended, you're going to maybe have a harder time using the standard pedals. If you don't know if your leg is pointed this way or left or right, I mean, that's something called proprioception. So we all can close our eyes and we know where our foot is in space and what it's doing. If you don't have proprioceptive abilities, you're not able to do that. And that's obviously a huge impairment with students with a lower extremity disability. And so oftentimes you see these students walking with some sort of problem in their gait, like a limp, or maybe they walk with a walker or some sort of device. That kind of tells us maybe something's going on with the lower extremities that we need to assess a little further. In addition to that, balance and how they transfer, how they get in and out of a car. Can they stand on their legs, or are they completely wheelchair bound? A lot of our kids with spina bifida, that's a big one that we see. Is that the student you're going to see? Our kids with spina bifida oftentimes are still able to ambulate short distances. So they can stand on their legs, they can walk maybe from the trunk of the car to the driver's seat, and maybe they sit on the floor of the passenger in this case. They sit on the floor and then they get up to the seat. So some of those students can still do that. A lot of them are in short stature, so they wouldn't be able to reach the pedals. And oftentimes those kids, you know, they have significant lower extremity function, even though they can walk short distances or maybe hop or something like that, they're not going to be able to use standard pedals. So we would talk about more of hand controls. Going to visual deficits, you know, probably the one thing, you know, we think a lot about visual acuity, and students take, or parents take their kids to assess, like, do you need glasses of some sort? Well, glasses is great, and that's what we get tested at the driver's license division. But if you have a visual field cut in your right periphery or left periphery, we're going to have some problems with driving. Okay, so some of these kids have were born premature or have had a stroke or something like that when they were very young, and so now those residual deficits, even though they look pretty functional day to day, maybe their visual field is still impacted. So that's a big deal. Cognition, I love the example you gave about your student who you talk to them, tell them maybe the rules of the road, tell them their stopping distance or when to use their signal, they can't remember. You know, she can't, maybe she has a really short-term memory problem, it sounded like, due to who knows what, maybe a brain injury when she was younger, something like that. So memory is a huge part of driving. And even my older clients with dementia say, well, how does memory impact driving? I mean, this student was learning, right? I mean, and that's kind of the hard situation about assessing these students is they're learning to drive. Whereas my older clients, somebody that suffered a stroke at, you know, 60, they've had a lot of driving experience, right? So these students that are coming up trying to learn to drive with a disability, most often we're going to need extra support, you know, extra maybe drive time or extra parent drive time, if it's a possibility. Okay. Is anybody lost so far? Do you know what I do? Okay. So I'm interviewing the patient and the student. And, you know, I think another thing to tease out, maybe as an instructor, especially, there's a lot of research about the desire to drive. And I think more and more of that is coming out, that some of our students now don't want to drive at 16, which is always surprising to me because I was excited to drive. But the desire to drive for kids with disabilities in particular, it needs to be their goal. If it's not their goal, if it's the parent saying, well, you're 16, you're going to be an adult, you got to go drive. Well, these kids that are neurotypical, you know, they've developed slower. And also our kids with disabilities, maybe our kids with a physical disability, you know, that kid hasn't had the option to be in the little Power Wheels when they were 3 and 4. You know, they don't drive the side-by-side or the golf cart because they can't reach the pedals. So they haven't had those experiences and that development in their brain to coordinate their arms separate from their legs. Some of our kids use a power wheelchair, right, with a joystick, but still that's different, we know, than trying to coordinate a lot of different systems and take in all the multifactorial issues with driving. And so some of those kids, they need time, they need experience. They're not cognitively impaired, but their physical disability has limited their upbringing and their development of those systems in their brain. And so sometimes you might think, whoa, this kid, not appropriate for driving, but really they need some practice because they haven't been able to, they haven't had the option to practice. So that's I think a point that I really want to make is that sometimes it's not that it's the patient's not ready, the student's not ready, it's that the development needs to come and they need more practice. And I feel like that's where our driving simulator can be helpful to give that option. But of course, if you're not living in Salt Lake City, that's not an option either. So moving on, so I talked about physical disabilities, vision, cognition, all of those combined create our reaction time, right? When you guys think of reaction time, what do you think of? Gas to brake, maybe? Like how quickly somebody can notice something and stop. What do you think about making a lane change or making a judgment at a left-hand turn? How is that related to reaction time? Anybody know? It's really their processing speed, right? Processing speed and the ability to divide their attention between two different things. A lot of times we call that multitasking. We know that a student needs to multitask in the car. We know that all drivers need to do that, right? But if the student can't divide their attention between two different things, if they can't remember what just happened so that they can then make the next move, we're going to be in trouble, right? Multitasking is huge for driving. And a lot of the students get hung up at that because, again, maybe they just haven't had the opportunity. Maybe their development is a little bit slow. So at 16, perhaps they're still kind of functioning like a 13, 14-year-old. Parents are still doing a lot for the kid, things like that. So the development of those skills may come later. And those are the students that we might say, hey, we need to hold off and wait for driving, okay? So there's a couple different ways I test reaction time. These are some of our fancy devices that we have in my clinic, which are helpful and give us some sort of idea. I don't know if my links are going to work or if you can see them on Zoom, but nope. Basically, this device here is one that I use called the Dynavision. And what you can see is the student would be trying to hit, well, the buttons are lighting up red. He's trying to hit them as fast as he can. He can turn his head and eyes if he wants. He might be testing peripheral vision here in this video, but the student can turn their head and their eyes. I encourage that as much as they want to try to hit those buttons around the periphery. The other test that I like on this device is if you see that little blue box in the center, might be too hard to go back. They use this for athlete testing. They have some of that, but they did a bunch of driving research on this device. And you can see on the device, there's a little blue box there. And one of the tests I give is a number would pop up in that box, like 2, and then disappear. And so the student has to keep hitting the red buttons and say the numbers as they're hitting the red buttons to kind of test that. Can you do 2 things at once? Can you pay attention to what's in front of you, but still notice what's around you? So there's research that's been done about how many buttons and how fast you can do that in what amount of time, and how that's related, and how that's related to safe driving and safe drivers. So that's a test we do for reaction time. This machine was upgraded to a touch screen. We also have that. The screen can rotate around. We can do all kinds of things to test kind of reaction time. But again, in my opinion, one of the things that best tests that is when you're out on the road, right? And maybe either hopefully this doesn't happen, but it happens to me a lot where somebody's walking across the street and the person doesn't see them and you're using your brake, or they're making an unsafe lane change. But trying to decipher, like, what is this? What am I seeing here? Why isn't this kid progressing and doing well during our drives is sometimes a problem. Another thing I use is, of course, our driving simulator, which is, do you guys have these in schools? I didn't think so. I mean, probably not this particular one, but I didn't think you had most districts don't have a simulator, but this simulator that we have is meant for all sorts of things, but it was designed for people in wheelchairs to be able to access it. You can see here, there's some standard pedals here. It also has a left foot accelerator, which is helpful. And then I can also mount hand controls on the simulator. And so that's where our students can kind of get an idea of what's possible if they're unable to use standard pedals. Sometimes, so about reaction time on the simulator, there's a gas to brake reaction time test where, they have to hold the gas pedal with the green light, they hold it on. As soon as they see the red light, they have to hit the brake, right? That gives us a reaction time, right? But again, the thing about that is it's not giving you the whole picture. It's not saying what's the student's processing time when there's more than one thing going on. So that's why I do some other cognitive testing besides just a gas to brake reaction time. Sure, there is evidence and research about what that means and if that person would be a safe driver, but at the same time, doesn't give us the whole picture. Okay, so I, just like you, have an adapted vehicle. It's a Subaru Forester, a 2014. I have my little student driver sign on the top. And this is kind of what it looks like inside. So, I have different mounts that I can mount on the steering wheel here for different types of steering aids, which we'll talk about. I have different sets of hand controls. We have a a left foot accelerator in this vehicle as well. So my evaluation, I'm doing all these tests in the clinic, right? I'm testing all of these things, physical abilities, vision, cognition, reaction time. At the end of the day, you know, what does all of that data, all of that information give me? Well, you know, it's really helpful to then go get in the car most of the time. So for you guys, you're having the students take your class, and if they pass, or maybe along the way, you're getting them in the car. Is that right? Oh, after the class. Okay, after the class. So you get them in the car. So they have to pass the class in order to do their drive. How do you guys decide whether or not they're ready to go in the car other than passing the class?
They have to have their hours with the parents.
What's
They
up?
have to have the 40 hours with the parents.
Okay, yeah, okay, that's a requirement. What else?
Their learners permit.
Their learner's permit, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that teases out some of the cognitive problems, especially if they can't pass the class, if they can't pass a written test, you know, we may have some trouble, right? What else? Have you had students that you're like, no, or anything like that? Maybe this girl that you mentioned, memory
She's
loss.
got a restricted driver's license now, so she can go, I think it's 50 miles of her home.
Yeah, yes, and I love that because there are lots of things we can do to say, let's restrict driving. You know, maybe nighttime driving is not a good idea.
She can't
Freeway
drive.
driving, yeah, freeway driving. We can restrict driving, and oftentimes I'm recommending that. Think about our students with ADHD. Some of those students, we start with restrictions and we let them drive 5-10 miles from home, and then maybe get the back and only familiar places, you know, and then kind of up the ante a little bit, just like you do with, you know, other drivers. But maybe they get more drive time, more hours, things like that. Do you ever have a hunch that this kid's not going to make it through the class? Yeah. How long have you guys been doing this?
I've been doing it 5 years.
5 years. Okay.
16, 18.
Okay. Yeah. Have you had students that you're like, no? When what happened?
Usually I say, hey, you, and I'll talk to the parents.
Yeah.
They need to drive some more.
Yeah. More
And
drive time.
They just need to drive.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think some of our students, you know, that's exactly the point. They need to drive. Sometimes the parents are limiting the students and holding them back, and that's okay. Sometimes because they're scared, a lot of times the first time parent, first kid that they're teaching. But a kid with disabilities, a lot of times they are more nervous for their kid.
That's it. I'll try it. So I don't know if the parents have to tell parents. Don't tell them stop.
Yeah.
Don't tell them you can go now.
Yes.
They've got to figure that out for themselves.
Yeah, amen to that. I feel like that. I tell them you can't be a co-pilot. You can be a navigator maybe if you want them to go a certain direction, but if you're having to be the co-pilot over and over and over, and they're making the same mistakes, you know, we might say we got to put driving, we got to hold off on driving. You know, that's some of the things I'm helping the parents kind of come to the realization, or the student too. Sometimes the student thinks, I want to do this, you know, because all my friends are doing it, and the student's not ready, maturity wise. And also we have a lot of evidence that shows if they can't do certain tasks, we call them instrumental activities of daily living. So it's things like doing your own laundry. Could you cook a meal? Could you go grocery shopping yourself? You know, things like that. Can they plan ahead and things like that, especially for our neurotypical students? Sometimes I encourage, I have a list of things that I encourage the student to become better at, like managing their own time, managing their own appointments, things like that before we're ready for driving. So oftentimes I'm talking to the parents and the student about that. After I've assessed that this isn't a good fit yet, okay? So now I'm going to talk mostly about physical disabilities, and maybe I'll come back to some of the other things. I think the one thing I want to say is that, you know, if there's a will, there's often a way as far as driving and physical disabilities. Cognitive disabilities, that's not always the case, depending on the student. Sometimes they're stuck where they're at and they're not going to get to the level of that they need to be at for driving. But oftentimes with physical disabilities, there are a million different adaptations that you can do. Guess what the problem is? money,
Yeah.
right? I mean, these vehicles are so expensive. And so we want to make sure that we are recommending the appropriate modification and adaptation to the vehicle before they're putting money into it. Now, our kids with disabilities, sometimes the parents already have the minivan that has the ramp that comes out and all that sort of stuff. Sometimes that's the case. And so we're modifying a vehicle already that the student can enter into with like a power wheelchair. A lot of our students with manual wheelchairs, you say your
It's a
kid
manual.
manual wheelchairs, you know what's happening? They're getting in the passenger seat. Mom and dad nicely taking the wheelchair and undoing it and putting it in the car for them. The student's never done it themselves. Well, what do you need to do to drive? You need to be able to access the vehicle independently by yourself, right? So that's what I usually start with our kids. Sometimes, you know, I'm like, have you ever broken down your own wheelchair? Meaning taking the wheels off, folding it up and putting it in the vehicle themselves. Nope. I could say like 98% of my students have never done that because they're a passenger, they're dependent. And that's part of my homework is like, you got to learn to be independent here. Driving's a big responsibility. Let's get you going on being more independent. So having them transfer into the driver's seat, learn about their wheelchair, how to take it apart, how to fold it, how to lift it up and bring it over the top of them. Most of the kids in a manual chair, let's say I don't know what kind of car they have, but let's say it's just a sedan. That's what would happen. They would break down the chair, bring it up and over their chest and put it in the driver's seat. And then do the reverse to get out. And that's if the student's fully dependent on the chair, meaning they have to transfer from the wheelchair into the driver's seat, okay? So before we even talk about driving, I like to talk about how are you going to access the vehicle and what vehicle are you going to modify? Because again, if we're going to be spending money putting modifications onto a vehicle, it better be a vehicle the kid is going to drive for a while. You know, I see kids that have 250,000 miles on some beater car, which is good for a new driver, right? But how long is that going to last if you're making modifications that cost $5,000 or something, okay? So there's all sorts of things. I've had students that their parent, you know, on their 16th birthday, the parent buys them this fancy new lifted truck, whatever. And I'm like, not a good choice, but there are options for trucks and things like that. So if you can see here, this is a transfer seat where the patient transfers here and then up. Maybe the vehicle is too high for them to just do do you know what I mean by transfers, going from one surface to the other? These are seats that come out of either the driver's side door or the passenger door for them to be able to transfer into. So they kind of turn and come down. It's called a valet seat. Also, you know, there is every type of vehicle, okay? I mean, it used to be basically if you needed to get into a vehicle with a ramp, so you're dependent on your power wheelchair. If you needed a vehicle like that, you had to drive a minivan. There was no other way around it. Nowadays, there's all sorts of things from rear entry ramps like this. This is a Kia Soul. I mean, just a little car that has a rear entry electric ramp. To side entry SUVs, even the Chevy Traverse right here, the door opens on the side. This truck, I have a patient that has a truck, a GMC like that. The entire floor comes out, lowers down to the ground. He takes his chair. He doesn't have use of his hands, by the way. But he uses a manual wheelchair. Takes his wheelchair and it automatically locks into that floor pan. The whole floor pan and door come up and slide back in to place in front of the driver's seat. I mean, there's all sorts of options out there is what I'm getting at. So lots of options for driving. Maybe we have a lot of these coming on the market, the Gold Wing. So the whole side of the door swings open. I mean, it's amazing with all sorts of modifications there. This is a lot of times what they're using. They're using maybe a transfer seat, that little tiny bench that'll slide out from underneath the floor of the car and drops down a little bit. The patient transfers up and then hooks it up to the outrigger. And then the outrigger swings around and puts the truck in the bed. And then sometimes, especially in Utah with our weather, they have a topper that's automatic as well. Okay. That type of modification or anything electric, as you can imagine, super expensive. Okay. Super expensive. Resources there are people that'll pay for that. there are funding sources like vocational rehab, independent living center are probably the two that the students could access the most, okay? So if there's a want, a desire to drive, there's a way to do it probably and get you in the driver's seat. But think about your students accessing their vehicle. How are they going to do that? And if you don't know, that's okay, but have the parents start thinking about that too, I think is the most important. Because we talk a lot about modifying the driving compartment, you know, which is what all these things are, but we don't talk about if you can't get in and out safely, you're not going to be driving, or by yourself. What's the point of you driving, right? So let's talk about steering aids. I recently presented to the Driver's Education Board, and we had this whole discussion about spinner knobs. Has anybody used hand controls in the car before? You're about to. Have you used hand controls? No, really? Okay. And sorry, where do you work?
Down in Richfield.
In Richfield. Okay. No hand controls.
Once.
Once. Okay. How'd it go?
Pretty good.
Yeah.
Actually, he had some use of his legs. And we found out in the end, he was probably better with his
feet.
than he
Yeah.
was with the-
Sometimes that's what I'm assessing too, because not all kids need the hand controls like they think they do. And depending on their severity of their injury or deficit or whatever, sometimes they don't need the hand controls. So I think it's important to know, as far as steering goes, there's lots of different steering aids that we can use for adaptive driving. This one's probably the most common, your classic spinner knob, okay? If you have a student that's gonna use hand controls, it's much safer to use a spinner knob. If you're only gonna have one hand on the wheel, imagine making those tight turns, right? They can't, and they're just learning to drive, and they have their other hand on a hand control. They're not gonna be able to do it efficiently and safely as well as they could with a spinner knob. Now, once they have experience, a lot of times they ditch a spinner knob, and that's okay too. And they wanna, it's not required, but in my experience, once you put that spinner knob on with a new driver, they're much more efficient steering while using hand control. So keep in mind that you know, the classic spinner knob is probably the majority of the things you're going to train with, but there's all sorts of, this is called a single pin. My guy that can't use his hands, his fingers to grip, can't grip this, you know, he's going to go into what's called a tri-pin, where his wrist is doing his wrist and his arm are doing most of the driving. He doesn't have to grip. His hand will set in there, but his forearm and his shoulder are going to be doing most of the driving instead of gripping the wheel. Okay. There's also lots of adaptations. These are the fancier, maybe higher tech spinner knobs, but we can add on blinkers. We can add on windshield wipers, brights, things like that. Because again, if you have a hand on a hand control, it's hard to reach those secondary controls, okay? So let's talk about, oh, this is just, well, that's a really grainy picture of a left foot accelerator. There's the mechanical version. Has anybody used that before? Okay. You can put these in, you can put them in and take them out. Our car has an electric one where I push a button, it's a left foot accelerator. If I don't push the button, it's just the regular right foot accelerator. Yeah.
So that where you put it in and take it out, you
Yeah.
could use that just in like in our driver's ed car.
Yep.
Put it in.
Absolutely. Yep.
Or
You
if
can.
if the parents had one for their own vehicle,
Yeah.
they could use it for their vehicle, we could put it in our driver's ed
Yes,
car.
yes, you could. Probably with your state vehicle, you'd want to have the district mounted in there for you, just because of liability purposes. But if you have one, or if the district has one, if the state has one, that's a very simple, very inexpensive modification that you can do. It blocks the right pedal and basically has a pedal on the left side. So it blocks the right pedal from their right foot hitting it while they're using the left one. But basically it's mechanically, you know, just with a bar, it's mechanically still using the same standard right pedal, okay? So that's a nice adaptation. Parents get real freaked out by a left foot accelerator, but guess what? That kid usually, if they're not gonna use their right leg for driving, that kid has always had their left leg as a dominant leg, and they're a new driver. For my drivers that have driven forever and had a stroke maybe, and now I'm having to switch them to a left foot accelerator, much more complicated, you know? So, but for our kids that are learning, they don't know any other way. And so it's the same, I guess it's the same as teaching any other student. We're just mechanically modifying the vehicle, okay? Okay, let's talk about hand controls. This is probably most commonly what you're gonna be working with, if at all. There are lots of different types of hand controls, okay? And I put some pictures up here just to kind of show you the hand controls. Most of your vehicles are going to be mounted on the left side, like this one or this one. Left side of the steering wheel. Does anybody know why we do that? With the hand control there? Because most of our kids are going to be right hand dominant. Your right hand you want on the steering wheel, okay? If you're your dominant hand, most kids are coordinated like that. But also most vehicles will accommodate this situation much better. So it doesn't interrupt in the way of the gears. If you put a hand control on the right side, it won't interrupt any of the gears and things like that. The left side just has more space. So it works for most vehicles. So most of the time, what you're going to see is this hand control called a right angle here in the middle, or this one called a push rock. I think that's what most of your vehicles have on it. Basically, you're kind of pulling down and towards you for gas and pushing straight forward for brake. So that's how it works. So if a kid's doing this for gas and brake, and then they got one hand on the wheel, you can see like reaching a turn signal might be tough, right? Or turning the wheel into a parking spot or a tight turn is going to be harder, hence the spinner knob, okay? An important point I want to know, if they're going to be using a hand control and a spinner knob, they want to, when they go in to take their test, their written test, they want to disclose that to the driver's license division because these modifications are illegal. It's illegal to put anything in the vehicle after OEM, whatever's in the vehicle, unless you have a medical reason, which our kids do, right? But they need to have this form. I'll show you this later. But this form here, I don't know where this camera is, so they need to have this form here filled out with a doctor's signature that says hand controls and spinner knob. Because we know those things are illegal unless they have this done. And if you go to the driver's license division presentation, they'll tell you that too. So the other, I'll get back to that in a minute, but most of your vehicles are going to have hand controls on the left. You're going to have the right hand on the steering wheel, maybe at 2 o'clock with the spinner knob or at 4 o'clock with the spinner knob. And that's probably what you guys are going to see. These are fairly low tech modifications. Everybody asks me how much they cost. Okay. You can go on Amazon and buy hand controls for a car. Don't do it. They're pretty scary. I mean, you can buy them for $250, $300. Those are called portable hand controls. They strap to the gas and the brake and they strap to your steering column. They're just not safe. They wiggle free. They're loosey-goosey. They're not the best. I say use those hand controls to adapt your side-by-side or your off-road vehicle or something like that. Don't use them for your everyday driver, especially for our new drivers that are just learning to drive. They're not safe. If you get them professionally installed and mounted and all of that, they'll be in the vehicle. They cost about $1,500. And the parents or any other driver can also drive with those hand controls on. They don't have to take them in and out of the car. The pedals are still free and open. Most of the time we don't block the pedals unless the student has spasms, like where they're gonna hit the pedals. It's pretty rare. But the parents could jump in that vehicle and drive the vehicle just like it is with the hand controls, okay? Questions about hand controls?
Does
Okay.
it interfere with your airbags and stuff like that?
Nope, all the way out of the airbags. They're all safety rated and tested and blah, 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 which is why I say, go get the professional ones. Get the professional ones. There's 4 companies in Utah that do them. There's a company in Las Vegas. So there's a company in Utah County and the other 3 are in Salt Lake County that do the hand controls. We have right mounted hand controls like this, which can be useful and can be helpful for certain situations. Like I said, you guys are going to be training on the hand controls that are mounted on the left anyway. When you use hand controls, did you put them in and out or how did that work?
The state had a car.
The state had a car.
They
Okay.
brought down some-
Yeah. So a lot of the cars, and yeah, they'll arrange for that student to drive with the adaptive equipment. Now, as a driver, as an instructor, okay, what do you think about that? How did you sit in the car and use the hand controls a little bit before?
A little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think what did you think of it?
I don't know. It worries me that they're safe enough to drive, but I mean, seems to work.
Yeah.
As long as you're cautious.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about it is these are new drivers, right? These are kids that, well, this kid sounds like he could use his feet, which is sometimes more complicated, honestly. For our students that don't use their feet at all, ever, they're in a wheelchair like 99% of the time. For those students, hand controls are actually like pretty simple. And for the student that maybe uses their feet sometimes, what I often say is get the feet out of the way of the pedals, cross your legs and bring them back as far as you can. Okay, so like for this kid, where he sometimes uses his legs, but maybe his legs aren't safe, let's say in a different situation. Cross those legs, bring them back, and then and get them out of the way, nowhere close to the pedals. You guys, hand controls are super common and super safe. They are, like I said, I mean, we have whole conferences just about modifications to vehicles, and these companies that do that, the hand controls, like I said, if you're buying some off Amazon, that's a whole different scenario. If you're buying some and having them professionally installed, they are super safe. I have hand controls on my vehicle. I drive it with hand controls often. And it's actually easier for our students to learn than for you to learn, right? Because you've learned with your feet. Our students have never known how to operate their feet, right? So a lot of them, if they're going to use hand controls. So teaching that student to use hand controls, you should teach them just like you teach any other kid, okay? Actually, some of my spina bifida kids, they are really good drivers right out of the gate, just like your maybe advanced students that just like pick up on driving no problem. That's kind of how these kids are. And the parents are in the car with me going, oh, I didn't know this is actually like pretty easy. And I feel really comfortable in the car. And I'm like, great, sweet. So sometimes my evaluation is just that, like getting the parents to be on board with us, you know? So, okay, I talked a little bit about, I gotta watch my time, the driver's license division, how to go about that. They need hand controls and spinner knobs on this form when they get their permit so that you then can drive with them in the car. I recently learned that with hand controls, our driver's ed teachers weren't putting spinner knobs on the steering wheel because they thought they couldn't, because they're illegal. It's not true. They are completely legal and much more safe than using hand controls without a spinner knob.
Is that with all the combination, like with the left foot accelerator?
Yes, you have to have this form. Any equipment that is not OEM, okay, that doesn't come standard in the vehicle. Okay, we have all kinds of equipment. The thing I didn't mention was turn signal extensions. Sometimes we just make the turn signal a little longer, or we put it over here by the spinner knob with like a little bar. I mean, it's not that complex, right? But that way they can use the turn signal with their right hand, right where their spinner knob is, and it works out great. So, so make sure that they're doing that with the driver's license division. Okay, if you have a student that you feel like is more complex, or maybe beyond what you know, I would be happy to see them. I've been seeing lots of kids for a long time, getting them ready. And that goes for physical disabilities, their vision, their cognition. Another thing I wanted to stress is, making sure that you're connecting. If the kid has an IEP, if the student has an IEP, making sure you know that and what it's all about. And sometimes that's a good, appropriate time to refer up to me for the student to come in and get an assessment by me. I think that training with hand controls, the biggest thing is like learning yourself a little bit, doing your own driving range with your hand controls, learning how to do hand controls and making sure that you're comfortable training that student as well. And also sometimes the parents have so many questions about modifications. That's not your job necessarily. So you're welcome to refer them to me. I'm happy to email and answer questions if they don't need to come in for an actual assessment. But also our vendors are really helpful walking people through all these modifications that can happen in a car. Because beyond just the basic hand controls, like I said, there's lots of different things you can do. So I'm going to try to stay on time. What other questions do you have for me? I brought our car here. If anybody wants to see it, I'm happy to take them out and check out the hand controls and see how our hand controls, I take them in and out. Your cars, I think they're set and kind of, I don't think they're removable. But my hand controls are in our vehicle. And the left foot accelerator, like I said, I can put it, or I can turn on and off. we have a website that talks about our driving rehab program. So this is the handout, and it gives you the website there. And then I'll give you my card with my contact information. Audra's been really great. If you have a question, you can send it up the line to her, and then she'll email me the situation and kind of tell me what's going on with the student, and then I can kind of take it from there. So if you need, and if any of you want to reach out to me about what, questions or anything like that, I'm happy to answer those as well. So I'll give you those. Yeah. Anything I didn't cover, and you have questions about? I don't want to drone on
Just
and on.
have your hours of operation, so.
Yeah, I mean, they vary a little bit, but typically, yeah, we're open 7:30 to 7. I'm not there every single day doing driving. I'm there 3 days a week doing driving. So I typically will see about 4 patients a day for assessments. And with our kids, what I usually do, if we talk about, are they able to keep up with their classes? What is the IEP plan? What are their parents noticing? What do they struggle with? Do they struggle with new learning? Things like that. I usually try to spend as much time in our adaptive vehicle as possible, teaching them the hand controls so that when they come to you, they've already had that experience. They know what to do, so they're not coming in cold. And the family also has a plan, because that's sometimes the biggest thing is the parents will come in and say, well, we have this Honda Civic, a 1998, and that's what we're going to put hand controls in. And I'm like, okay, well, is it going to last you? Is it going to last the student? And there are certain, depending on the type of vehicle or things like that, if it's a lot of modifications, they're having to buy an $80,000 car or van with a ramp and all these, the driver's seat's going to come out, the student's going to drive from their power wheelchair. I mean, that's something to plan for. It's a lot. So I talk to the parents a lot about the timing on modifying their vehicle and getting the student into driver's ed, because sometimes that's the holdup. They haven't had any drive practice hours in order to come drive with you with hand controls. I mean, that's a huge barrier. And if the student needs lots of high-tech modifications as well, that's a big barrier, because we have to get the funding, we have to do all sorts of things. I consider hand controls low-tech. They can be in a car in a day, and the student can be up and driving, as long as they are learning to access the vehicle.
So the one I'm dealing
Yeah.
with, the mom, she's like, she's the one that's worried. And
Yeah.
I don't know if he is really, ready or what, So it's just that she was like, because I've known this kid since he was
Okay.
elementary school.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I know he's coming up. So
Yeah, and he's how old now?
I think he might be 14.
Okay. Yeah, I
13 or
think
14.
a good time is 15-ish, when they are starting to know the rules of the road, and especially if they've taken their written test and have their permit. That's a nice time to come see me, and I can walk them through how to get hand controls in, or I can first of all, assess if and that's really what I'm there to do, is assess the patient's skills and abilities, right?
Whether or not
Assess
this
is
a good
appropriate,
idea. 'Cause that was
exactly.
the mom that's wondering.
Yeah.
She's like, do I really want him driving?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, guess what happens? The kid turns 18 and they want to go
They
to
want to leave
college,
or
or
something.
and then all of a sudden it's
And then now
emergency.
his mom's like,
And they don't have a vehicle, they haven't been independent. I mean, it's a huge problem. And so if the student's cognitively ready, I would say the cognition part, if they are, a lot of our kids with spina bifida, they're cognitively intact. There's no other like learning, visual issues, cognitive issues. It's literally a physical disability. That's so easy. But it's these other things that kind of can get in the way. Kids with maybe muscular dystrophy, cerebral palsy is a big one. Where we can have some of those other systems like vision impairments, cognition impairments, those things are harder. Yeah, because you don't want to adapt a vehicle with all these modifications and then it not work for the kid. So assessing the skills and abilities is number one, but then number two is teaching the parents how to adapt their vehicle and what vehicle is appropriate and that sort of thing. So, any other questions? You guys might not be here for my presentation, so I won't ask you. Okay, all right. Yeah.